one area after another that the Chinese are spectacularly unreliable. They don't keep their word. You spend ages negotiating with them. It's like, I don't know, somebody once talked about being pecked to death by ducks. It endlessly goes on. And at the end of the day, you think, well, they've made such a fuss about negotiating it that they're bound to stick to it. And then they don't, whether you're talking about issues like trade or whether you're talking about issues today like global health. They flagrantly broke the international health regulations, which is one of the reasons why that pandemic took off so fast and affected so many people.
So we'd seen, over the years, the Communist Party, since the handover in 97, we'd seen them pecking away at the terms of the joint declaration. It was much more obvious in 2020 when it happened all at once with the Hong Kong national security law. But why was Britain not able to enforce any consequences? Or maybe the question is, why were there no consequences in the joint declaration as part of those terms if the CCP were to violate that treaty?
That's a very good point. Why wasn't there any arbitral procedure? And I think that was because it was probably at the time, I didn't negotiate it, but it probably thought it impossible to do. And that if the whole thing was enshrined in a treaty at the United Nations, that should be enough to make sure that it was guaranteed. And also, it used to be argued by some people in the UK that since we'd set Hong Kong on a course of democratization, the fact that people would have more say in their own future would itself be a break on China breaking its word. And I don't think, honestly, that we thought that China would break its word so vehemently and across the board. And I think one of the reasons why it did so in Hong Kong was pretty clear from the time that Xi Jinping became the dictator in China. Let's not mince words. When he was ascending to the senior post, he instructed the party cadres and the government cadres to engage, in his words, in an intense struggle against, and then they listed all the features of open societies, of democracies, of free societies: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, parliamentary control, and so on. And when you looked at that list, it was a pretty good description of Hong Kong. And the Chinese obviously thought, or Xi Jinping obviously thought, that those aspects of freedom represented an existential threat to Chinese communist rule. Now, I'm going to say something now which some people don't believe. I was, until recently, the chancellor of Oxford University. I was there for 21 years. And quite early in my time, we had a visit from somebody who became head of, under Xi Jinping, of the anti-corruption party committee, and then eventually vice president. And he was an interesting man and a very, very clever man. He's, with Zhu Rongji, I think the cleverest Chinese official I've met. And he'd been mayor in Beijing, and when he was coming through Britain, he was then the vice minister for economic affairs. And he was coming through Britain, and he'd had an organized for him trips to the British Olympic Stadium, and he'd seen enough Olympic stadiums to drive him insane, I should think, over the years. And he was taken to the Science Park in Oxford. And then we took him to the Ashmolean, where he was quite cross because the ambassador stopped him going and look at an exhibition we had Yashmaline is our main museum, of Cultural Revolution posters. And the ambassador was very nervous about him going to see that. But he was obviously a man of considerable artistic knowledge and tastes. And he wasn't so much interested in the Chinese artifacts. He seemed to be much more interested in the examples of the Italian Renaissance, including a famous painting of a hunting scene, which is always thought to be one of the greatest examples of perspective in early Renaissance painting. He went back to look at it 2 or 3 times. We then took him off to lunch with a lot of Chinese students and academics. And after a bit of time, he said, his ambassador came over and said, it's time for you to go back to London now, Minister. And he said, I can't go back to London yet. I haven't been to the Bodleian Library. It's one of the greatest libraries in the world. It's our main library. So we got the librarian, who was a very nice American woman called Sarah Thomas, who'd been at Harvard. We got her back from a walk in part of the parkland in Oxford. She'd been walking her dog, and she came back and she showed him all the main Chinese artifacts in the Bodleian. And he was plainly disappointed because he thought that in the Bodleian Library, there was correspondence between the great French political philosopher, Alexis de Tocqueville, and an Oxford academic in the 19th century. Well, there was, but it wasn't in the Bodleian, it was in our college library. Nevertheless, we then, from that, discovered that he was passionately interested in de Tocqueville. And not because of de Tocqueville's book on democracy in America, but because of a book that I had to study at university when I did history, a book called the Ancien Régime and the French Revolution. It's a wonderful book. Why was he so passionately interested in it? Because de Tocqueville's main conclusions were that even though people in 18th century France were getting better off, it didn't make them easier to govern. Indeed, it made them more difficult to govern in some ways. And secondly, de Tocqueville's big conclusion was that authoritarian regimes were always at their most vulnerable and their weakest when they tried to reform. And de Tocqueville's book, Ancien Régime, suddenly sales of it in China spiked. It became bestseller. It was compulsory reading in the party school. And it obviously greatly affected not just him, and he was at the moderate end of the leadership, but other leaders as well. And I think when Xi Jinping became leader, they started to think that under Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and so on, that China wasn't turning into a multi-party democracy, but certainly things were freeing up. There was civil society. There was civil society which was arguing with the government and local government. And there were newspapers which attacked corruption in local government and in government as a whole. And I think they began to worry the leadership with around Xi Jinping that they were starting to lose control. It was personalized as well because there was a very charismatic Chinese leader called Bo Xilai, who tried to elbow his way into the leadership. And that, I think, spooked the leadership as well. But above all, I think that they began to feel that they were losing control, as I think they would say, east, west, south, and north. They'd been in control of everything before. And I think that was reflected in their attitudes to Hong Kong, because Hong Kong was plainly an example of the sort of freedoms which they were terrified by. So it's a long way of tying in Alexis de Tocqueville to the modern Chinese Communist Party. But I've always been convinced that that really did have an effect on some of the leadership. That perception of how vulnerable authoritarian states could be once they tried to reform